compliqué de lire sur l'ordinateur. Bonsoir à tous. Écoutez, je vous propose de démarrer pour cette troisième et dernière conférence.
Good evening. This is our third and last crash conference this year. And we're going to discuss and listen a presentation about a PhD's thesis, providing care to foreigners in France, the relation between NGOs and the states in France from the 1980s till nowadays. We got interested in this thesis for various reasons, as various crash members here, and personally, and Caroline Izambert, our guest today, and myself have known each other for some 10 years now, approximately, and we've worked together in a local organization in France called C'est France Là, which was a kind of think tank about the migration policy of Nicolas Sarkozy, the former French president, between 2008 and 2012. At that time, I was not working at MSF, and Caroline Izambert, was a teacher. She used to teach history in junior and senior high school, which she's been teaching up until 2 years ago. And today, she's the head of advocacy at EHESS, which is a French NGO helping people living with AIDS. And amongst various works, she's led a PhD thesis work at École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, working on access to health care for foreigners and migrants living in France in the 1980s and 1990s. And the second reason why we've invited Caroline today is because, quite naturally, throughout her research, she got interested in the work of MSF and also that of Médecins du Monde, and it is likely that some people from Médecins du Monde are with us tonight in looking into how these schemes were developed to help foreigners have access to health care. And at MSF, what is called Mission France is certainly not well known and has not really been the object of a lot of research work. In 2010, I myself produced an article which was published in the book Agir à tout prix, but Caroline's ambition is far broader than mine. And tonight, she's going to try and report part of this history and give you an overview of this history of NGOs in France. The third reason why we've invited Caroline is because, to a certain extent, this PhD thesis was made possible, and I'll try to be humble here, says Michaël, thanks to the access MSF and MDM have provided to researchers, that is, access to the MSF and MDM Médecins du Monde's archive. So here you have quite a thick book, a thick thesis, which is also a demonstration that MSF and MDM are opening their doors to researchers. And we're hoping that the findings of this research will help MSF be better known, as well as its history, and help the thinking process about its operations. These are just as many reasons you might think of to justify this invitation, even more so that she presented a thesis a month ago, so it's still fresh in her memory. Therefore, she's going to disclose an overview to MSF, and I'm very pleased for all these reasons to welcome you here, Caroline, hoping also that this presentation will help opening up the debate on what she's going to tell us
les questions qu'on peut se poser aujourd'hui.
And also link it up to the questions that are raised today at MSF Mission France.
Plus généralement, sur un certain nombre de
And more
questions
broadly,
qui sont abordées régulièrement dans le cadre de nos débats sur
some questions that we discuss at MSF internally. How do we allocate resources? Why do we decide to open up a program, or why do we decide to shut down a program? These are topics that are quite often being discussed with those who attend the project coordination training module that we have launched at Crash at the foundation nowadays. Some of those who've attended this training being with us tonight. So that's another additional reason for having invited Caroline today. We'll stop here for my part. As usual, I suggest that we'll go for a 30-minute presentation by our guest, and then we'll have a Q&A session, and then we will go for a drink. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for being with us, and thank you, Caroline, for being with us today.
Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I must say that I'm pretty scared, even though presenting to a PhD thesis jury is always likely because they don't know the sources and they will accept all the arguments because they're not truly knowledgeable about their story. But reporting to those people who have the history and have the knowledge is even more difficult, and it's your history, and that there are two relations related to MSF France, Mission France. Either you know every date and detail and controversy, and I'll try to report those. And with some MSF members, I've had quite interviews, one of which went for 7.5 hours, and I didn't have to send any reminder to the person, or it was completely ignored, i.e. the French mission, the Mission France. Even though there is a culture of transmission of history, the French mission of the 1980s, 1990s does no longer exist in the collective memory of MSF. So I'll try and report it to the audience tonight. First and foremost, I'd like to thank people because I'd like to say that just like Michael has said it, I would like to thank you all because I've had access to all your archives, all the papers, all the cardboard boxes, and I was still teaching at that time. I was given the keys of the library and the documentation center at MSF, and this has helped me look into the document. And sometimes I was even offered cups of coffee. I didn't have to pay a penny for that. It doesn't work everywhere like this. It's not always like this, that people will open up their doors. And some organizations sometimes will keep their archives for themselves and don't want to share them, while MSF up until today gave me access to everything, and I've had access to the vision and the ideas and thinking process at MSF. I'll try to frame briefly my thesis. Talk about MSF, of course, but it was a broader thesis. I've tried to report the history of state medical aid, as we call it in French, the aide médicale d'État, which is the health coverage for undocumented migrants. To put it in a nutshell, I said that the poorest people in France have access to health care thanks to PUMA, which was formerly called a universal healthcare coverage, and the complementary fund that came along with it, allowing to manage some 100% of their health care, which is not always great for the the care, such as eye care, but then that's something that works more or less. And then there is aide médicale d'État, which works also more or less well, which is specialized and targeted at undocumented migrants. I see people nodding in this room. And it's a decision which is unique in Europe. There are some countries in Europe where there is access to healthcare, but here it's a one-stop shop with the French bureaucracy giving people a card, a number, and a registration number, and they're well recognized by the French welfare system, while the official statement is that they should go back to their home country. So I've tried to better identify this crazy bureaucratic and red tape system, so much that people who are not supposed to be here are provided with medical help. And it's a history which covers 2/3 of my thesis. And then I looked into what was happening in a hospital and then in a local NGO to see what were the actual consequences for providing healthcare under this universal healthcare coverage. And I've tried to identify what was the role of humanitarian organizations in founding this universal healthcare coverage, and simultaneously the funding of the French state medical aid funding. I don't know whether you've related MSF and CMU, as we call it, but Rony Brauman is nodding, but he's not the best person to prove that. I'm not sure that everybody here in this room remembers everything. Maybe people remember that of MDM with a visible action in France, but I'm not sure that in the collective memory that MSF is being recognized as having contributed to the universal healthcare coverage law. So I've tried to see in my thesis how this healthcare coverage for the poorest people, there was an additional layer of that for foreigners, and what was the role of humanitarian organizations and their relations with the home countries. Do we have any legitimacy to operate in our home country? Does that mean that we have to have special and unusual drivers, or should it be just like any other MSF program? And are we allowed to talk openly about any topic? And as you will see, when it raises this question is whether we are present in the political debate on migration. And this was true for 20 years between the 1980s up till the end of the 1990s. Should MSF be involved in the debate on migration beyond the mere question of healthcare coverage? And this can certainly echo your operational process today. So I'll be telling you a story. Maybe some dates and names might be missing, and I might have forgotten some dates and names. And it's true that I could be even more accurate from the historical standpoint. So in the middle of the 1980s, we were faced in France with this issue of the new poverty, quote unquote, because besides the homeless, drunk people living in the streets, there was new poverty because there was a rise in unemployment, because we were faced with a rising working poor class. There was an increasing number of single-parent families, single mothers, and there were some social issues emerging. One emerged slightly later, which was so there was the Resto du Cœur, which started, but then the issue of health emerged. Was there any concern about access to healthcare for the poorest of the poorest in France in the 1980s? For many people, it was not the case. There are many things that are going wrong in France, but people were clearly in agreement to say that we had the French Sécurité Sociale, so the health service, with this myth about this scheme which was designed after the Second World War. And amongst those who were the defendant of the process, you would find the humanitarian doctors. Those who were going on humanitarian missions, when they came back to France, quite often working for the Paris hospital network, they would say that the difference was such between what they had observed in the countries where they had gone on a mission and their working practices in France. The gap was so huge that they said, well, there's no concern for France. And even though there are some concerns, it's not like Afghanistan, it's not like Kenya. One should not exaggerate. And amongst those doctors, some started to say, well, still, you know, there are some people who are in a poor condition. We have people from NGOs such as ATD Carmonde, or also a small NGO which was called Remède, or Remedy in English, which was providing free care. And also, when it came to donations, things had started to erode right from the beginning of MSF. There was a steady growth in fundraising. And humanitarian doctors, the French doctors, had a great image. And, you know, it was obvious that the French humanitarian medical NGOs were providing health care, that they deserved care. No, they deserved money, she says. And therefore, the donations were on the rise as the number of missions were on the rise. And as from 1983 up until 1995, it started to decline. But I haven't seen the letters, but people started to send out letters to MSF and MDM, letters stating, well, it's great what you're doing abroad, but what do you do for the working poor in France? What do you do for the homeless people who are sleeping rough in my street? What do you do for my nephew who cannot have access to health care or reimbursement of health care? So the legitimacy, which seemed to be untouchable, started to erode slightly. And we were in a political environment where the Front National, the National Front, was on the rise in France in 1986. They had a very high rate because there were proportional elections at the French Parliament. So the chauvinistic arguments became more and more visible on the French arena, and therefore this universal humanitarian ideas was giving rise to questions which were not raised in the 1970s. And this has led to the starting of an exploratory mission, and Médecins du Monde started to enter the fight. And in 1986, they opened up a health center in the center of Paris. And I remember, but I know the debate is behind us today, it's history, but when MDM was doing something, it was tough for the others not to be present. So it went well beyond all the debates they had. And MSF therefore started its exploratory mission, and 1 year later in Saint-Denis they opened the very first health center providing free care in Saint-Denis in the north of Paris. And from then, the legitimacy of this center, of this French program, was constantly discussed. This is to be found in the minutes of the boards of directors meetings up until the early years of the 2000 decade. They rediscussed about the raison d'être of the Mission France. How big should it be operationally speaking? Should it be providing care, or should it be more on the advocacy or plaidoyer side, or rather, I would call it lobbying, to put it in clear words. This center in Saint-Denis therefore opened, and from the operational standpoint, it was rather a modest program. It would be comparable to a GP's practice, but it would not cover all the needs that you would find in an area where people didn't have any healthcare coverage. But the initial idea was that MSF wanted to start some operations, come up with statistics and report, use data to lobby the public authorities and help contribute to change the French health system. So it's an operational approach which is completely different from the one you would see in an emergency setting, which is the usual business of MSF, so to speak. So MSF's French mission was to have a specific type of operations with specific means and resources. But in the beginning, it was difficult because Médecins du Monde had started earlier and faster with Bernard Kouchner, who's very close to the public authorities and who was appointed as minister in 1988. And that's when the other NGOs started to be more present. And internally, they still had debate at MSF, and I will quote a report. BF thinks that the healthcare provided in the Mission France are expensive, more expensive than the traditional general medicine. We would rather give 85 francs to those people so that they would go to a GP who doesn't have any patients and who is dying of hunger. So for 13 years, more or less, those who were in charge of the operations at the Mission France had to listen to these arguments at each and every board meeting. So that's the legitimacy problem for this program, and they had some great difficulties in lobbying, which was also part of their mission at that time.
Par ailleurs, la population qui est reçue dans des centres de soins gratuits n'est pas tout à fait celle
the patients they were providing care to were not the expected profiles. They were expecting poor people, families, unemployed people, jobless people who had ended up in the street, this idea of the poor people we had in the 1980s. But those who came to the center were single men with psychiatric problem, drinking problems, the profile of the usual homeless people we had known for many years. And another share of the patients were foreigners who were accumulating huge administrative problems and who were living in great poverty. So these people with social and residence and health problems were not the profiles which were expected. And exactly the same thing was happening at Médecins du Monde in their center. And initially, there was a kind of embarrassment because the idea was to reform the French health system. It was not about granting new rights to foreigners. In some reports, and this is true both for Médecins Sans Frontières and Médecins du Monde, there was a kind of understatement regarding the presence of foreigners in the health centers. One said that in the report, one patient out of two in our center is French. What does that mean for the others? Is there any logic in that? Is there any reasoning in that? And also something which became more schizophrenic, patients who were increasingly foreign patients. And the advocacy work was more talking about those people who were not attended in the healthcare centers, people who no longer had any healthcare coverage, who were postponing care, care because they could not afford to pay it, and who would not go to humanitarian medical associations. And here again, this discrepancy was very present and underpinning the work of the mission as from the 1990s. A militants and activist network started to grow and started to work with those who were helping foreigners. Esmeralda Luciolli founded the mission in the early 1990s and then gave it to somebody who was the head of the mission and who was really embodying the mission, Noël Lannes, who from the 1990s up until the year 2000 and up until the CMU law was passed, was really the head of this and embodied this. She relentlessly wrote and reported inside MSF and outside MSF that one should not be a substitute to the public authorities. So that was the first statement she made, that they should tackle those centers who are not complying with Hippocrates' oath and the need to provide care universally, regardless of the status of the person, and that this idea of people did not have any money was not something acceptable. MSF would never accept these arguments. And the fact also that freedom of speech at MSF should have driven them to be more aggressive. And for years, MSF came up with positions and stances. And I realize now my thesis is a bit old because last year MSF made strong statements about the migration policy in France, but those statements were unprecedented. In 1993, there was the hospital, an outlaw in a conference which came up with a report about so many situations where there was a denial of care in hospitals. Many of the Paris hospitals who were at the top of the pyramid of the French medical hierarchy. And it was really tough. You could read letters between the health centers of Paris and MSF. MSF said, you didn't provide care to that patient on that particular day. Please tell us why. And if you don't tell us why, we will have it published in the paper or we'll take you to court. Just to report about the general atmosphere of that time.
Parallèlement, je vous le disais tout à l'heure, MSF
in addition, MSF started to work closer with NGOs helping migrants, GISTI to start with, which is the information group and support group for migrants, for working migrants. And they not only help working migrants with Patrick Mony, and I'm quoting him because he's a great activist defending the cause of foreigners and access to social welfare for foreigners and migrants, and his name is not mentioned anywhere. And if there is still access for children's benefit in France, it's thanks to him. So some of the radical activists who were working in France on the legal aspect started to work with MSF. In addition, in the 1990s, up until the occupation of Saint-Bernard's Church, there was boiling in social movement because Charles Pasqua was appointed as the Home Secretary, and he was really a repellent, so to speak. Everybody was against him in France. And then there was it was the time also when the fight against AIDS started to be present on the public scene with all the actions of the NGO ACT UP, putting a condom on the obelisk on the Concorde Square. So it was not always visible, but MSF cashed out money several times for some spectacular initiatives that I didn't even know of before starting to work on my thesis. Then there was the 1993 law presented by the Home Secretary at that time, that is Charles Pasqua, which was very broad and was about reforming the law on the right of residence for migrants in France. And all those people would no longer have access to the French welfare system, neither would they have access to any form of support. That was his proposal. Had the law been passed, those people would not have any access to healthcare except via the ERs of hospitals. These projects had been in the drawers of the ministries in France for some 15 years, and they were presented at the French Assembly, and the members of the French Parliament were about to vote it. And at that time, MSF and MDM started to speak out about migration, and for the very first time, the Mission France and their field expertise and experience justified the statement in favor of access to healthcare for foreigners. But it was not good enough to convince the Home Secretary. There was a right-wing government. They were not really sensitive to humanitarian arguments. And MSF was wondering about what it could have done. First of all, MSF tried to see if access to healthcare would be possible for children, and did lobby the Home Secretary cabinet to try and see whether it was possible to negotiate. And something quite funny happened. It was a lobbying work. People at the Home Secretary cabinet said, okay, MSF, please draft us a note for tomorrow morning explaining why we should provide access to healthcare for children. So they rushed and drafted a memo, and that's what Noël reported. She called Patrick Mony, who was the GISTI activist, and said, why do they want this memo for tomorrow? The law will be presented at the French Parliament in a month from now. Beware, if they want something from you very quickly, it's because they're going to do some bullshit with it. And Noël realized that indeed that they were being fooled, and that Pasqua was about to use the note written by MSF and say, we have a very good project. Even MSF says that we're providing healthcare for children. So it was a close shave. So they stepped back and they tried to find other ways to tackle this law. And then somebody who was at the French Parliament, Claude Maluret, who is a right-wing member of Parliament, not exactly the same political wing as Charles Pasqua, even though he was the right wing, but he had excellent relations with what used to be his former home, that is Médecins Sans Frontières. So Noël Lannes approached him, and you see the difference between an NGO such as GISTI and ACT UP and MSF. MSF does have access to some people that other NGOs do not have, and Claude Maluret accepted the argument put forward by MSF. Claude Maluret was not a good friend of Charles Pasqua, and he found there a very good opportunity to oppose Pasqua. And at the very last minute, he achieved that the medical help, which was the medical or healthcare support, which was not only for undocumented migrants, but also to poor people who did not have access to the French Sécurité Sociale, so that access will be preserved for those people. And it's interesting to see how he won with his argument at the French Parliament. Not with such arguments as humanistic or humanitarian argument. He didn't come up with public health argument, which were the arguments quite commonly used by NGOs defending the right to health care for foreigners. I must tell you that I've done that quite often, which is from the scientific viewpoint. You don't want tuberculosis everywhere. Even from the moral and ethical standpoint, that's the argument we're using. But at that time, public health was not a trendy or a fashionable topic. We said there are many doctors amongst you, and you will no longer have the freedom to practice. You will be hindered. We are a medical community, and we are working beyond any political divides. And you wouldn't want to be in a hospital, in an emergency ward or elsewhere and say, you give care to that one or not to that one because he doesn't have the documents he is supposed to have.
And it's true that among the parliament members, you have a high proportion of physicians, of doctors. And thanks to that high proportion of physicians represented at the National Assembly, Claude Maluret managed to preserve that minimum access for illegal aliens to health care. Now, parallel to that, the Mission France was quite fragile internally, and also there were a number of conflicts, clashes that would be settled at the board usually. The first clash was between Mission France representatives and another legend of MSF, who was Xavier Emmanueli. In 1996, Xavier Emmanueli, along with Jacques Chirac, who at the time was the mayor of Paris, treaded on the territory of what we call SAMU social. That is a system aiming at helping the homeless with teams roaming in the streets, and then what are called nursing beds for people who do not need to go to an emergency unit proper, but they're so deprived of any health care at all, and they have been on the street for so long that they need a place to rest simply. So those are called nursing beds. Now, what's the contradiction between the free health care as seen by MSF and this particular project of SAMU social, providing health care for the homeless? It could almost be viewed as being complementary, and yet they were at war, those two projects, because for part of the Mission France, creating those nursing beds was accepting to provide medicine to the poor only, and a form of medicine designed for the poor. They went as far as calling it poorology, like, the science of the medicine for the poor. and reserved for the poor. So MSF said, we want to do away with nursing beds. We want a real sheltering solution, a real housing solution, however temporary, along with proper medical care. Now, I'm trying to narrate what was said at the time, but you have to imagine also that these people who were opposing themselves had gone on missions together. They all had strong personalities, compelling personalities, and they could really be angry at each other, which was a penalty for the structure. And then Noël ended up telling Xavier Emmanueli, "You're betraying us." And he, in turn, told her, but with your dossier activism, you're breaking away from our identity, which is intervening in a time of crisis or in a situation of crisis. And by refocusing my action on healthcare, I'm the most loyal to MSF ideals. So they were all fighting about who was representing loyalty to MSF ideals. And the board of MSF was split in half, even though the Mission France seems to have prevailed. Now, there was another more underlying conflict, less visible, but maybe also even more traumatic for the organization, and it's a kind of clash that is common among NGOs. Starting in the early 90s, a number of local authorities, municipalities, decided to address access for healthcare for people in need, and they started setting up systems at the municipal level, particularly when it came to supplementary healthcare coverage. Now, in the mind of Mission France, once you have managed to set up this system, you have to close it and go, because otherwise you're substituting the services that the state should provide, and then you're providing a form of medicine that's only for the poor, which runs totally against the values of Mission France. One of the arguments to decide not to stay was that we would call on volunteers at times. The idea being that when you hire volunteers, unpaid, it's easier to close down a mission or an activity. Well, this is counterintuitive, because when you have volunteers working somewhere, they will never want to stop. And when your volunteers are retired doctors whose only ambition is to practice until they die and beyond, it's impossible to stop that kind of project. The question arose in Lyon, where the municipal council set up something, a system that was not perfect, but yet that allowed people to access general health care. Now, the board of Mission France wanted to close down, but the doctors, the physicians in Lyon, stepped their foot down. They refused to close down the mission, and it lasted for a long time. They called each other's name, and it was quite traumatic. So this difficulty, to make the decision of closing down a healthcare center is the same phenomenon at Médecins du Monde, MDM. It's always problematic. So before you decide to open up a healthcare center, think about it twice. So we saw the emergence of a series of clashes and conflicts, which led Mission France to gradually slip away from its mission in healthcare provision and to go towards more advocacy and more political type of action. It lasted over a few years, and finally they joined with the more radical fractions of the social movement, namely ACT UP, GISTI, GISTI, CIMAD. Well, you can hardly call them radical, but anyway, civil society organizations that were working on the political plane. So their main cause became healthcare for foreigners. During the years of the fight against AIDS, there was awareness growing against what was called double penalty. Often, people who were HIV positive had been like drug dealers sentenced to prison, and then they would catch HIV because there is very little access to clean syringes, and because of what was called double penalty, they were forcibly returned to their country of origin, where usually, in the early 90s, they wouldn't be given any health care for AIDS, so they would just die there. So the Nonprofit Association ACT UP addressed that topic. And, it's not a very sexy cause, poor foreigners dying of AIDS in their home country. No one was interested. But MSF decided to allocate some money in that. And they created AMDEF, Action for the Right to Health Care of Foreigners. And they lobbied a lot, put up dossiers together, lobbied the prefectures, and did also some actions on airport premises, because their main action was to prevent the deportation of those people, what was called the double penalty. When they were sent back to their country, they demanded that they could stay in France to be given health care against AIDS. In those years, never mind whether it's right or wrong, whether it happened once or twice, but the idea was that or the feeling was that I would be surprised, but people said, the rumor went that you had activists ready to lie down on the airport strip to prevent the planes from taking off, to prevent them from taking those people back to their country of origin. And here, once in a while, it was said that once in a while, a little group of MSF people would all gang together to go to Roissy Airport and prevent a plane from taking off. Many people don't know about that. Of course, the AMNEF kind of drowned the identity of MSF, but you could say that activism at MSF became more radical around that issue, and that in their own country. So what happened next? On the board, as of 93, 96, the question arose and was hotly debated. Should we intervene on immigration issues? Immigration issues, how are they related to healthcare provision? Noël Lannes launched the idea of a legal cell, legal unit for foreigners. The situation became really bad because of the Pasqua Act, said Noël Lannes. We have the moral duty to intervene and do something, inferring that no one could do it as well as we could at MSF. GISTI, they don't have the resources, CMAB, they're too routine. So even though it's not our primary mission, we, MSF, it was the discourse, are the best position and the most apt at providing healthcare to foreigners. Now, Mission France decided at that time to maybe turn to risk mitigation, risk reduction for drug users when that was the turf of MDM. They opened an office for the youth in Marignane because the National Front, the extreme right, had set foot in that city at the time. So they were hesitating what direction to take. And at that point, the left arrived to power in France, and it reshuffled all the cards. We shifted from Pasqua type of brutal right to the left. At the time, there was a lot of revival of the whole imagination around the resistance movement. There was the trial of Préfet Papon. The idea that prevailed was that you had to be on the right side. You shouldn't be a collaborators. You should be among the justs and the righteous, and not get it wrong. Those were the ideas of the day. And that's why probably MSF, even though it was not in its DNA, took that path. And then after the parliament was dissolved by Lionel Jospin, it became more complicated, the political situation in France. So Mission France regeared itself to providing health care to foreigners that were severely ill. There was a law that said that foreigners, if they cannot have access to health care in their home country, can come to France to have that treatment. That in those days, the fight against AIDS was totally reconfigured because of the new drugs. And therefore, it made sense to have a law to forbid the deportation of foreigners back to their home country if they had AIDS, because they could now be given treatment in France. So it happened on a case-by-case basis, but they obtained their papers under that law. And then when the Socialist Party came back, that was the possibility to engage in a big reform of social health care and welfare, which was the original idea of Mission France of MSF. And then almost overnight, Mission France decided to refocus on demanding what was called medical coverage for all, or CMU, universal medical coverage. Immigration issues becoming secondary. The idea was that poor people who cannot make both ends meet, whether they're foreigners or not, or people who didn't pay any dues, can still have access to a basic healthcare scheme, healthcare coverage. MSF, luckily enough, they had enough resources. So during a year and a half, 3 to 4 people worked full-time on this advocacy initiative with the public authorities and with the private office of Martine Aubry. MDM, UNIOPS were also active in lobbying. But MSF, by being able to reshift their action nearly overnight, made close ties with the private office of that minister. In those days, the 90s, everything was done on paper, so you can look at the correspondence and the memos or inputs and contributions. It's like a draft bill that MSF was drafting. And you find wordings that were created here at MSF, and that ended up being in the bill and then the act. One fear Mission France had was that the complementary health insurance companies would take over, considering that the poor were just a market like any other market, and that they would tread on that field. So Mission France pleaded for the possibility to have a complementary insurance scheme under the general social security system. And this is the case today. And you don't have to go through a private insuring company, even though it's possible. So that was a fight very dear to MSF, to the extent that they paid a full-page advertising in Le Monde, the famous daily paper. You know, they did have access to Martine Aubry, the minister at the time, but they wanted to warn her that this was a major job in the social field, and that it shouldn't be sold out to private insurance companies. And, you know, paying for a whole page of advertising in Le Monde, that would cost a substantial amount. And MSF did that. They decided it was worth it. So the bill was passed. It was voted into an act in the wording very close to MSF's plea. So it was voted, but it excludes illegal foreigners. Now, the people at MSF who worked on that at the time said, yes, we saw a whole avenue opening up. 4 million people would be concerned. And then in our power struggle with the public authorities, we decided to drop our focus on foreigners and providing health care to foreigners, because we were finally reaching our goal, obtaining universal health coverage for all the poor, and we didn't want to get astray. And all the historic partners, such as GISTI and ACTUP, throughout the bill process, will focus on providing health care to illegal migrants or illegal foreigners. It was finally decided that the basic CMU, basic universal coverage, or the complementary health coverage, would not be for the foreigners. They decided to create a whole separate parallel system to get equivalent health care under pretty much the same conditions. But in that way, illegal foreigners are not mixed with the rest of the destitute who need that. And they decided to allocate social security numbers only to foreigners who were regularized. So the law was passed. It was a big victory in a way. But Mission France, MSF Mission France, was a bit disappointed. I've read beautiful interviews. MSF Mission France discovered that they had acquired some clout, that they were powerful, and they felt disturbed. You know, they decided that thanks to our money, the funds we raised, but all our lobbying, we finally wrote that bill and that act. It makes you a bit dizzy to realize you can have this power, but that you lost your target. And after they obtained that, after they had that big victory, which was the original plan, they were left wondering what to do. And in the following years, just like in the years 2000, there was lots of doubt about what operational direction to do. They decided to provide shelter to homeless. They wondered whether they should do something about the 2003 act and bill. They wondered whether to have a joint signing of a letter between MSF and MDM, but they were still a bit at odds, but they managed to release a press release together. But Mission France was a bit at a loss as to what to do. And in 2003, 2004, they will stop any activity, and Noël Lannes will leave the association. Now, that history would deserve being rewritten with an external eye. In 2007, you reopened a mission for asylum seekers, but this mission was to close down later on. It generated lots of heated debates again about the legitimacy of doing something in your own country and about speaking up about immigration issues. And then around 2014, 2015, you had Coquel interventions, and then the center in Pantin that opened up for young unaccompanied minors. So you keep constantly going back to and revolving, gravitating to the notion of access to healthcare in relation to your country of origin. And should MSF, how entitled is MSF to speak up on the migration policy, particularly in France, MSF having its headquarters in France?
As an old-timer, I'd like to make a few comments. First of all, I think that it is an outstanding and specific and summary, and it brings to my memory what I've lived. I was head of MSF up until 1994, but it's very good to reflect what has happened. And on a pinch of salt, if I may, in 1985, 1988, we went through a financial crisis. There was a decline in fundraising, but I don't think it did play a key role as to the future of the Mission France, of the French mission. It was discussed in a very pragmatic way in France, wondering whether France should be excluded or not from our field of our interventions because it was France. Maybe there was a legitimate answer to a legitimate question. No, and say that humanitarian doctors were more interested in exotic poverty rather than the poverty at the corner of the street is a debate that has already been there. It is still being discussed. There was no particular peak at that time. But the involvement of Médecins du Monde, the famous Brzezinski report, and Médecins du Monde, who responded very quickly with many internal conflicts amongst the leaders of MDM, that are conflicts that could be compared to the ones we've had at MSF. At the board of directors, there were many hospital doctors at the board. And as you said, hospital doctors were blind to what was happening outside the hospital. This blindness was even more acute at the time of the campaign of outlaw hospitals, which caused a lot of turmoil within MSF. But the French mission was right at that time when they were pinpointing at problems. Even though the problem was not that broad and that deep, it did exist. and it was worth pointing at it. And I would end up and say that it's not the end of the story with the problems that you were underscoring. Personally, I think I wonder, should MSF be involved in the French policy regarding migrants and foreigners up to a certain point, and when it comes to practical issues, yes. But when it comes to the migration policy itself, I would say no. It's just about being consistent, or rather the idea that we have of a humanitarian action is. For others, it's a broader sense. It is obvious that hospitality and providing help shouldn't have any condition. And this is also true for migrants, but this is a debate throughout the humanitarian community. And so far, a restrictive answer has been given to this question. And I think it's consistent. And that's what you've actually very well described with the difference between the CMU and the AME, Caroline Izambert. When it comes to donors, what is interesting is that it is mentioned as one of the arguments to open the mission, and the fact that it was not really used as an argument. It was put forward, it was discussed, but when the fundraising letters were sent out, it was not successful in the following years, and it was not present at all. It's true, there was this empirical demonstration that this demagogy was useless. When it comes to the demonstrations, I remember having taken part in some of these demonstrations. I remember one where there was a picture with Caroline Izambert, who was our general director at the time. Maybe that's a sign for research. We were in the streets, they were in the street close to Roissy Airport. But on the runways of the airport, that's a legend. Thank you. Esmeralda is my name. I was in charge of the French mission from 1986 till 1992. So I'm taking up after Rony. I've attended the presentation of your thesis. I must say that I'm quite impressed by the quality of your work, and I think it does reflect pretty well what we've gone through. It's a very interesting work, and looking back in history today is very interesting, particularly today. There's one thing that you didn't mention, but I would like to discuss it. In the beginning of the Mission France, the French mission, we went through another debate which had been at MSF a few years before, because you've talked about the volunteers, and there was the issue of professionalization of humanitarian workers. It was difficult to have this mission approved by some MSFers, and I do think that it was a program or mission unlike any other. We've worked with volunteer doctors. We collected drugs from others. And at that time, it was not possible for our missions abroad. And it was said we would not send doctors who are not trained and go there for 2 weeks, people who are inexperienced. We wouldn't send out drugs from donations to our programs abroad. And then we said for the French missions, we needed to buy drugs. And then people say, no, that's impossible. We will be collecting from Pharmacists Without Borders. At that time, they had a huge warehouse of collected drugs in Clermont-Ferrand. We tapped into that in the beginning for the French mission. And we went through the same debate of professionalization with some members of MSFers who said, yes, abroad we need professionals, but the volunteers and collected drugs in France is good enough. We don't need to buy new drugs. We eventually bought new drugs, but it was interesting to see that we were going through the same debate as the one we had had at the end of the 1970s. And then it led to another debate. What quality of care? Both when it came to comparing it with the quality of care provided by the standard French system and the quality of care in our missions abroad. It was another debate, but it is also to be linked up with the nursing care. It was also a question of, people who would go along and who would be agreeable to work together. And also we worked on the type of care to be provided. And another issue with the buses. In the beginning, there were these initiatives in Marseille, which were also a source of controversy and debate between the heads of the French mission, that is including myself, and the local antennas, as we call them, who designed this program. And then Noël went further than I did on this and said that we could not have consultation in buses, that it was low-end medicine, etc. And there was this whole debate about what type of medicine, what quality of care we're aiming at, what is the kind of medicine we provide to poor people. These are additional comments. You've probably looked into that in your thesis, but I think it's also worth mentioning. It's also interesting to note that this question is also raised at MDM. They have different ways to respond to it. MSF talked more about professionalization and then had fewer programs. And then there was a financial challenge at the end of the 1980s. Then in 1990s, the French mission had a heavy budget in the MSF budget because you had to pay social contributions, etc. And it was an issue for the board of directors because it was a huge budget, even though it was a small size program. So by narrowing the range of care provided, the budget was very high, while MDM had the CSOs, the access centers, and the frontline product for the public was that it was a medical consultation, but also what was key in the MDM healthcare centers is that they will also do the administrative work, making sure people would have access to social benefit and things like that. And financing social workers is not really sexy and appealing, while funding a healthcare center where you provide care to children is something that is more appealing. And so that's the way the two organizations have looked into this quality of care issue. And that is really something I've had great difficulties in finding an answer. What was the care provided, the actual care provided? Well, we know these programs have produced a plethora of epidemiological data. But that, for instance, having access to information so that how long would the consultation would go on, how many times would patients come back for consultations. I didn't find such data in the archives. Access to healthcare for the poorest people. Médecins du Monde has had exploratory missions in what you would call what we call in French the medical deserts. That is, and I think I'm not sure did go very well. Some people will report it better than I would because they were not welcomed by the local GPs. Quite unusual when MSF started at Saint-Denis. The medical board of Saint-Denis was not happy at all to see those coming. When there were buses, they were considered as tinker's medicine. And eventually the medical board did not file a complaint, but they were threatening. So the humanitarian ideal, settling down in a location, in a remote location, is a source of anxiety and frustration. And it's not only MSF and MDM, but when you have a project providing healthcare in France, they do that to reach out poor workers who do not have a private insurance, additional health care, and they end up providing care to undocumented migrants or asylum seekers who's been denied the refugee status. I realize that I only talk about the past. I'm sorry, I'm not talking about the future. But it's quite interesting. In 96 or 97, MSF was threatened to be taken to court by the French Conseils départementaux, the county councils. And MSF threatened to take them to court because they were not providing health care to people, because these county councils were giving vouchers to people. You have 3 vouchers to go to the GP, 2 vouchers to go to the dentist. And if you need more vouchers, you will have to come and defend yourself. And this is not what was written in the law. In the north of France, which is the department with the more restrictive regulations about that, a press conference was convened, and I don't remember exactly what the MSF representative said, but he said, we're eventually reaching out to those people we wanted to reach out right from the beginning of our program. We are reaching out these poor workers who've lost their jobs and who no longer have access to health care. And it is true that in this humanitarian action, it seems that they could not find these potential beneficiaries. It's as if they were fading in the air and then they would no longer be visible. I'd like to respond quickly because I think that in your thesis, there is an interesting episode that you report about, because those patients made in the center were not the expected when MSF started to conceal the figures. There's an incipient controversy because MSF had entrusted a provider to collect the data about these centers. And it's as if the organization wanted to keep silent the profile of the beneficiaries or the patients. I'm not sure they did it in a conscientious way, but they had serious argument, if I may say so. One doctor had written a thesis about the number of foreign patients in the MSF programs, and he came with a blunt conclusion and said, with all the existing systems that are being designed by the French government, in a few years from now, there will only be foreigners and undocumented migrants in the MSF centers. And all this was relayed and presented by MSF. This thesis was found in the French National Library. It was as if it was sealed and not to be made visible, but from the methodological standpoint, it was certainly an excellent work. And I think it is still the case that this is a difficult relation with figures and facts, with this statement stating you need epidemiology, etc. But I'm not a specialist of methodology, but the healthcare centers will not allow you to have a powerful statistical data. So you group the diseases together, but they don't really reflect or match something. You mix undocumented migrants with documented migrants, and you produce a report, and you don't really know whether this is indeed reflecting the truth or whether this is a product for the public authorities or if it is to be included in the annual activity report. I've not compared it with other missions, and it seems that the data and figures sometimes tell more than what you think. You may fiddle around with figures as long as you can. When you have 50% of the patients are born abroad, 50% of the people are born abroad. One of the twists we use, you have pie charts, and there is no comment with a title that doesn't have anything to do with what is visible in the pie chart. That is that 50% of the patients are foreigners. I am not sure that it is so specific to the French mission, to the French program. I think it's about how you relate to science and to science to describe an action which is also reflecting the humanitarian world in these years, but also today. Nathalie Godard from MDM would like to give us some about it and talk about this relation to figures, because MDM also produces a lot of figures, you know, the health observatory, etc. So what is your opinion about it? Thank you for this additional question, Michaël. I do work at Médecins du Monde, indeed, as to the medical desert. As you, Caroline, you know the history of MDM much better than I do, because I'm not an old-timer at MDM. We've had, in the early 2000s, an exploratory mission in the Combrailles in Auvergne, that is in the center of France, and another one in Alsace, in the eastern part of France. And then there was in Aude, in the south of France. So there are two MDM programs in rural areas, in the south of France and in the center of France. And in Auvergne, it was very difficult when we started the program because MDM was not welcome, because we have this. First of all, there is confusion between MDM and MSF, making things even more complicated. And then we also have this image of an international humanitarian medical association saving and rescuing people in Africa. And when you arrive in Auvergne, the local municipalities were not very happy to see us coming in. It took some time before we could actually settle. Now, we do have a program in the Combrailles which does work rather well. We're accepted. It's not direct healthcare. It's a healthcare mediation service that we're providing, helping people having access to healthcare when they do not have access. We're not a substitute for GPs. Neither do we provide quote-unquote humanitarian medicine. And we've started to work with other patients, like people living in slums. So that's for the medical desert, as they're called in France. Now, as to the difficulty there is in working on poverty and working with foreigners, we're faced exactly with the same problems at MDM, and we regularly have the same debate. Are the CSO MDM centers? There's some 15 of those in France. Initially, I don't think they were designed to help and provide care to foreigners, but rather to healthcare to those people who are poor. But today, the image of the MDM CSO is that they're only providing care to foreigners. 97% of our patients are foreigners. So the observation of health problems deals only with foreign patients, not necessarily migrants who recently arrived in France. You might have some migrants who've been in France for many years. Whether we should call them migrants again, I don't know. But we're talking about people who do not have access to universal healthcare coverage, and we try to refer them. and is the same approach as the one described by Noëlan. We're not a substitute. Those people can be having access to healthcare in the standard healthcare system. We're just referring them. No, MDM does have the Observatoire de l'accès aux soins, the Access to Healthcare Observatory, which does report about our field programs. But 97% of our patients are foreigners. And when it comes to figures and our official statement, we talk first about poverty. That's the first thing we put forward, not the fact that people are foreigners. The first thing we point out is that people are poor, and therefore you broaden the scope, and then you can talk about sex workers, homeless people, drug users, people living in slums, migrants sleeping rough, etc. And the common point between those people is that they do not have access to healthcare just because they're poor. We want to put the emphasis on something else. If we help them out, it's just because they're poor. Comes second the fact that they're foreigners, and they're poor just like any other French people who might be poor and who are faced with similar problems. We were involved in the consultation process convened by the French government in the fight against poverty, and we came up with the data from our program, and it said the fight against poverty and the poverty of foreign people is also part of the debate, of the general debate on poverty. It shouldn't be dealt with separately, and that's what we're trying to work on.
Qui est aussi mon collègue de Médecins du Monde. On est juste deux, vous inquiétez pas.
I have another colleague from MDM. Only two of us, don't worry. Patrick Bouffard. I'm a board member of the board of directors at MDM, and I'm a volunteer doctor. In addition to what Nathalie said, I'd like to thank you very much for this historic piece of work. It was very interesting to hear your revisiting of history, and also there is a political dimension to what you say, and it's spot on. So the principle of not substituting an existing system, that's essential. Now our role is mediation. There are more milestones that we could revisit in that history, but your work is very interesting. You have a historic view on that, but it's also interesting for forward thinking and foresight. Now, figures. We're not epidemiologists proper, but figures are essential because we can turn it into advocacy, make them political, like this idea with our observatory. It's a political tool to call on the authorities. We have figures, we have field experience. We're not crazy. We don't want just to have a few mobile clinics here and there to provide healthcare to the poor. No, we're serious about all that. Your work is also forward-looking and forward-thinking, and it's at the same time highly topical and very useful. It really speaks to us. It's highly topical, again, spot on. Those are the big issues at hand. You mentioned the operational aspect and the political work we have to do. I don't know how we go about it, but we'll have to go together at it. Have you seen a move towards a banding together of the civil society organizations, the pooling of work, like the ODSC action we put together along with MSF? The ODSU, this observatory. of the right to health care for foreigners. We should do away with that silo mentality and band our forces together. There's a great deal of social violence we're trying to combat. And we don't want to create oppositions between the people we want to work for. We'll have to be extremely united between our organizations. Fabrine Bessman from Crash. A comment about what you call the nursing beds. Your opposition with Xavier Emmanueli, you know, those nursing beds, that was not a cheaper form of medicine. Why was that put on the table? Why did that criticism arrive? And then the matter of non-substituting an existing system, well, it's all based on the notion you have about the role of the state in social justice, but you can transfer that. It's in the name of that principle that we closed down our mission in Madagascar because, you know, the pretext was that combating poverty was not the responsibility of MSF, but it was the responsibility of the state. And we should not take away that responsibility from the state. Everything we heard from Rony, Esmeralda, our MDM colleagues, I agree with them, and you retraced the whole history of the time. But we still have a little difference with MDM. I'm delighted that today you're sticking to the principle of non-substitution. But at the time, you used to get subsidies from the local authorities when this is something we never did. That's a basic difference between MSF-run dispensaries and MDM-run dispensaries that were often subsidized. Yes, we had to wrestle with those old doctors or dentists who would refuse to provide a service they should have. But we had that difference. You know, MSF was using its own equity, its own money, whereas MDM was subsidized. Now, about your presentation, you mentioned TB and the rest, but I think it's mainly AIDS. And people, you know, confusing AIDS, transmissible disease, you know, they never really got it. And it scared people, and that helped us. And I would like to thank ACT UP. It's an organization I really love. So do I, says Caroline. Just to answer briefly, that's the MDM doctor, about the fact that we were subsidized by funders. You know, something political is our financial balance sheet. And if we do get money from funders in a situation when fundraising is going down, you know, money is given to us by funders that we can make something socially worth it. We have our own freedom to spend that money. We can use public money to engage in mediation, to provide health care for the poor. You know, we want the role of health care provision mediator to be recognized in the field of public health. Everything you were narrating, I wasn't born yet, but, you know, I feel totally okay with the fact that we can be subsidized. I have my own freedom, imagination, and I can make a political and social output that's really worth it. Where's the problem? You used the word political. What you do with that money is political. I think we make too much opposition between engaging in politics and providing healthcare. There is a lot of room to just provide medical healthcare and do it better and more efficiently. At MSF, we've been fighting dogma and hindrances to provide better healthcare. That's what we did with nutrition, how to do better, more efficiently, at a lesser cost, and while being innovative. In France, you have lots of dogma and hindrances. The big debate, let's not overload hospitals with undernourished patients, malnourished patients. But, in France, we have many, many dogmas to fight. And I think Mission France was not very innovative. I think I was disappointed when they hid behind the fact that they would only provide health care and stay away from politics. I think it's all political. Right then, dear friends, I'd like to conclude with two comments. First, I was familiar with that history at large before I delved into the details, thanks to Caroline, but I was struck to discover how close we were in the 90s, how close we were to some activist organizations, particularly GISTI, and this totally disappeared from the memory of our present association life. I've been interested in Mission France. I heard about our interactions with GISTI, but when we had to have relationships again with GISTI, it turned out to be complicated, because GISTI is complicated, because they're very political and radical, because they're in favor of freedom of movement for migrants, they're lawyers. And so we had to keep a line between the two worlds. But it was pretty reassuring to find out that we were able to overcome our reciprocal prejudices 30 years ago. Same kind of resistances as you can find today, but we were able to overcome them and band our forces together. Now, this is Caroline's work, her PhD dissertation, which is not readily available, or which is not, readily available, but hopefully by next summer there will be an adaptation of that big piece of work for the general public. I do hope this work will be circulated within our organizations and to a wider audience. Thank you so much, Caroline Izambert, for coming. And thank you, everyone. And now we'll have a little drink together. Thank you. Good evening.